In a multipolar world, which I think we're very much moving towards, if we're not already there, in a world where there's going to be the United States, maybe China, Russia, you could throw India in there, maybe Brazil, whatever, you need at least one of these major poles to be pro-freedom technology, as close to it as possible, because it's not going to be Russia and it's not going to be China. And so when the United States is antagonistic towards this technology, it ends up having an impact on people around the world. So we want to get things right enough here. We want to protect P2P rights, which is why I also covered the Samurai and Tornado Cash cases. And I don't do that because I just want those rights to exist for me or for Americans. I do that because I think what goes on here is going to have an impact on the rest of the world. What I had witnessed in the music scene, oh wait, this is just people building across the world, building together in like this sort of almost this anarchic fashion, and it doesn't belong to the state, it doesn't belong to a corporation, and I just like, my mind was just utterly fascinated with this. And I didn't fully, it's not like I immediately saw like the human rights implications, though I had, attempted to take money out of an ATM in Venezuela in my life and not been able to do that, or lived in a place in Africa that was so far from any place that could even distribute money that, it would take hours to get to. It would have taken hours to get to. I had that in the back of my mind for sure, but I think the other side of it was I had plenty of student loan debt, and I was like, oh, this thing is going to go up forever? Great. Like I need something to go up forever because my loans are I'm struggling to pay the interest on the debt that I owe for graduate school.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Think Bitcoin podcast, where I talk to Bitcoiners about big ideas, about art, philosophy, the humanities. If you've been enjoying the show, please take a second to like the show, to rate the show, and of course, to subscribe to the show. Today's guest is Frank Corva. Frank is the White House and political correspondent at Bitcoin Magazine. He is also a contributor to Forbes and an advisor to Heatbit. He's also a prolific writer and commentator on global Bitcoin adoption. We talk about Frank's journey into Bitcoin. We talk about art, creativity on a Bitcoin standard, the importance and value of storytelling, freedom technology, human rights, politics, and a lot more. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Frank Corva. All right, we are live. Frank Corva, welcome to the Think Bitcoin podcast. Thanks for being here.
What's going on? Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So Frank, we were talking a little bit offline. You have such an interesting job in this space. You've got your hands kind of in a lot of areas. I think you get to witness a lot of things and see a lot of things that other people don't get to see. So definitely excited to dive into a lot of that with you today. First off, though, I want to do a little bit of background. I think most people know what you do now, Frank, but I'm not sure I don't know if I've heard your kind of Bitcoin origin story, how you got to where you're where you're at now and what you're doing. So could you kind of let folks know how did you get into Bitcoin, and did you ever think that you were going to be a political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine, covering all the things that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, and my family still, one of the things that came to mind immediately as you were asking me that question, I used to be very much more, I guess, politically to the left, but also, I taught immigrants for 12 years as an English teacher. Well, I also taught abroad in Venezuela and in Japan, but I was training to be a clinical social worker. So my job before this, I was counseling Holocaust survivors and working with active drug users in one of the worst neighborhoods in New York City. And I never thought that much about money. And it was luckily before my work doing more socially oriented stuff, I was in the music business where I worked with a lot of DIY bands. I also worked for bigger record labels like Warner Music Group, but even that had a bit of like, we were signing other independent labels to help them do their distribution. This was back when people were still buying CDs. So this is like giving you some idea. I'm dating myself here by even saying that, but early 2000s, mid 2000s. So I did that work, but I grew up, I think it worked. It's worth going back this far. I got into the punk rock and DIY hardcore, or DIY punk rock, hardcore, hip hop, all the stuff that was happening both in New York City and on Long Island back in the 1990s, late 90s or so. And a lot of that culture was, again, I use this term DIY. It was very DIY oriented. And it wasn't like, oh, let's wait for a record label to sign us, or let's wait for someone to put us on a big show. It was, let's book our own show. Let's put out our own record. Let's book our own tour. Let's do this. And there was just this ethos of like, we're not asking permission. We're just doing it. And the music's going to be loud and it's going to be in your face and all this stuff. For people who aren't familiar with this genre, you could think, and most people might know the likes of Henry Rollins, Black Flag, that kind of stuff. And this
I will
spirit,
just, Frank, I do just want to stop you only just to
yeah,
let you know that you're talking to somebody who I have a Black Flag tattoo.
there you go.
If I were to be wearing a sleeveless shirt, you would see the bars on my arm. So,
Perfect.
I love where you're going with this. So keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, I have some punk rock bands logos tattooed on me as well. I won't get into that too much, but so yeah, I was really inspired by that when I was younger, and um did this other work. I'm very much, even with what I do now, I tried to do it with a human-centric lens. What does policy look like, and how is that going to affect people's ability to use Bitcoin? But I first needed to obviously learn what Bitcoin was. But I'll go back even a little before that, and I'll quickly touch on this. I lived in Venezuela at the beginning of hyperinflation. I had some family there. I ended up teaching there, living in what's called a barrio, which is like the favelas or the townships, the really poor area of the country. So I was living in that barrio, teaching at a Catholic school there. It was one of the reasons people probably didn't, my neighbors were being murdered, and I was watching some pretty gnarly things happen while I was there. But I think because I was teaching at a Catholic school, there was a little bit of like, one, this guy probably doesn't even have a lot of money. Two, he's sort of like, well, he's doing good work, we'll sort of leave him alone. But I had family. My cousin married a woman from that barrio. His family, my aunt, one of my aunts, and my uncle brought their 4 kids down there in the 80s to do work with a food cooperative and it turned into also a cooperative hospital, but also an organization that helped abused women, a school system called Fe y Alegría, which means faith and happiness. It's a Catholic school system. That's the one I taught in. So I had this really cool access to living in this barrio. And this is, again, at the beginning of the hyperinflation type stuff happening. Chavez was still in power. Things hadn't gotten really bad. They got bad I left in 2011. They got bad about 2 years later, like super hyperinflation stuff. Before that, I had been working I couldn't make this up in a quadrillion years. When I left the music industry, I waited tables, and I became the personal waiter for a gentleman named Lou Ranieri, and he was the guy who invented mortgage-backed securities. So that was what collapsed the global economy in 2007. Well, I'll say this to his credit. The abuse of the product is what collapsed the economy. The product itself probably should have never been created, but when he was in charge of it at Solomon Brothers, it was actually managed fairly well. They weren't putting garbage mortgages into the securities. Not that the product was a good idea to begin with, but it wasn't as bad when he was in charge of it. And if you ever read Liar's Poker or The Big Short, I think he's quoted as saying, like, if you get rid of me, this thing is going to fall apart, which again is probably the reason it should have been created in the first place. But to his credit, I don't think it fell apart under him. But regardless, I became his waiter, didn't know who he was, but I was managing this restaurant after leaving the music industry, and he asked me to go to Ghana to oversee the building of a trade school. So I ended up in rural Africa because he knew like a Ghanaian priest from his parish on Long Island, New York, where I'm from. So very crazy that I go from working for the guy who created the product that collapsed the global economy to living under the beginning of hyperinflation in Venezuela. Didn't know what Bitcoin was at this time. Came back after all that. I did my master's, became a teacher, taught in the New York City public school system, taught immigrants within the public college system in New York for a while. And a very sort of weird thing happened on the first week of January 2018. I'll go back just a week before that. On New Year's Eve 2017, I decided, at the time I was working 7 jobs. I was teaching at 4 colleges. I was doing some work for United Nations. I was tutoring. I was waiting tables just to get by, living in like a shitty apartment in Brooklyn. And I was like, all right, I'm going to stop drinking for a year. Didn't have like a drinking problem, but I was like, in New York, you go out and, drinks are however expensive. I'm like, even if I had 3 drinks on a Friday and 3 drinks on a Saturday, we're talking about maybe $50-$60 at the end of the month. That's what, $250. It's like, all right, at least I can maybe quit one of my jobs and just kind of, not have this expense in my life. And I went to a birthday party for a friend the first week of January. And that friend at the birthday party was like, I want to explain this thing to you. Now he explained to me XRP that night, and I think he was explaining it as if it were Bitcoin. He was directionally correct, but after a little bit of research, realized that like, okay, I get what he's saying here. But what immediately came to mind once I started understanding what Bitcoin was, and even the way he described it that night, was what I had witnessed in the music scene. Oh wait, this is just people building across the world, building together in like this sort of almost this anarchic fashion, and it doesn't belong to the state. It doesn't belong to a corporation. And I just like my mind was just utterly fascinated with this, and I didn't fully. It's not like I immediately saw like the human rights implications, though I had attempted to take money out of an ATM in Venezuela in my life and not been able to do that, or lived in a place in Africa that was so far from any place that could even distribute money that, it would take hours to get to. It would have taken hours to get to. So I had that in the back of my mind for sure, but I think the other side of it was I had plenty of student loan debt, and I was like, oh, this thing is going to go up forever. Great. Like I need something to go up forever because my loans are, I'm struggling to pay the interest on the debt that I owe for graduate school and even undergrad still. So there was a bunch of factors that went into it, but the real lens through which I viewed it, because I'm not a super technological, and I back then I really didn't understand money that well, was that DIY social, we're just going to do things, we're going to build this thing. It exists outside the parameters of the traditional structures of the state or a corporation. And I was just like, what is that? What does that even mean? And from there, I studied it for probably about 3 years before I started writing about it in late 2020.
Hmm. That's really well. First of all, Frank, I mean, we're all going to be expecting your memoirs at some point here because that is quite the journey. So there's so much to dig into there. Uh, that's interesting. I mean, I think I have such a weird backstory as well. I mean, I was also a teacher for a period. Thought I was going to be an English professor. Went to grad school for that. Was a night watchman at a high school, an overnight watchman in West Side Chicago for a little bit. Had a bunch of odd jobs myself. So you speaking about that was it was resonating with my own journey a little bit. Just the heterodox, just kind of there's a lot of random stuff going on there. But all of it like forms this like picture though in your brain of the way you see the world. I was just talking to Aaron Daniel, who's an appellate attorney who now is starting this insurance tech company in Bitcoin that's super interesting. And he was talking about growing up in, spending a lot of time in Africa because of his dad, and seeing a lot of, currency debasement and violence and bloodshed and civil war, stuff like that. But then also being an attorney and his appellate practice and that life experience formed the aperture through which he started to see Bitcoin clarify to himself. And it's very interesting listening to people talk about how the aperture opened for them and how they began to see it. And it's different for everybody. I think the stereotype is we're all like finance or tech people or cypherpunks or whatever, but it's really like people have this collage of experience, and the collages can be really different, but they all open up to like the Bitcoin vista, which is fascinating. But so, Frank, I want to start with the most recent article you wrote on your Substack, which we'll plug it at the end. But also, I would just say everybody go check that out. You wrote an article called "Why I'm Here," and it was about the time you spent. I think it was probably a week or two ago now at the Global Bitcoin Summit in Nashville, which I believe is a conference focused on freedom technology and sort of that side of the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I was telling you off air. I mean, I was moved by it just because it was very earnest, sincere kind of play. It was like the self honesty was striking. I mean, you were basically expressing this tension where you were saying, you love going to this event because of the freedom technology, the human beings that you encounter there, the things that they are using these tools to protect themselves against, or to protest against, or to try to transcend or surmount in some way. And you wanted to tell those stories more.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, I want to get into storytelling, and I want to get into freedom technology. But before we do that, I just kind of, in the spirit of that piece, I want to give you some space to just, can you tell us some of the highlights of that conference, some stuff that we weren't all there, but I sounds like there was a lot of really inspiring stuff going on. So I'd love to give you some space just to talk about some cool things that you saw there.
Yeah. So I don't want to say, I can't get into who was there or whatever. You may have seen some other stuff on social media, but there's like kind of a Chatham House rules thing where you can kind of talk about what you experienced, but you don't want to get into specifics or details. Lots of incredibly inspiring activists, potential world leaders, doing really, really important stuff. But more than that, not just there to say like Bitcoin rocks and we love it, more like to learn to like what is this Bitcoin thing? I thought it was just a speculative asset for dudes that look like you, like white bros or whatever.
Hmm.
And I think credit to HRF and Gladstein and his team. They've really, I think they're really starting to they're starting to create such a synergy with the sort of like Bitcoin and human rights, and it's definitely not a mainstream narrative yet, but the more it's definitely spreading, and at the very least it's a great way for people to introduce people to other people, introduce Bitcoin to maybe normies in their life. Like, well, you would want these activists, you would want Alexei Navalny's team, right? A pro-democracy activist. I'll say that Anna Chekovich works for HRF. She was there. She was Alexei Navalny's CFO. Navalny was the basically Putin's main opposition in Russia, and he didn't have, when he was designated a terrorist, and the Anti-Corruption Foundation, his foundation, was designated a terrorist organization. The only thing, they had all their banks shut down and all they had left was Bitcoin. For as many people in my life I was just talking about this on a space, there's a lot of people in my life who are more politically to the left, especially because of the work I used to do teaching immigrants and as a social worker. So they look at Bitcoin as like this extension of capitalism, which it is, but it's like real capitalism versus the crony capitalistic system that
Hmm.
we live in. Um, they don't love Bitcoin because what they see in the United States, or in the West at least, is maybe the ETFs or just sort of it being a speculative tool, whereas they don't see the freedom technology side of it. So I sat in that room, and I'll say this, I can't get into too much of, like I said, what was said there. Um, but the reason I accepted the position that I did with Bitcoin Magazine, with the White House, and with being a political correspondent, I'll be honest, it's not because I'm like a massive Trump person or anything like that. And at the same time, I'm grateful to the stuff that he's done. I could call balls and strikes with what he's doing. Um, in a multipolar world, which I think we're very much moving towards, if we're not already there, in a world where there's going to be the United States, maybe China, Russia, you could throw India in there, maybe Brazil, whatever. You need at least one of these major poles to be pro-freedom technology, as close to it as possible, because it's not going to be Russia and it's not going to be China. So when the United States is antagonistic towards this technology, it ends up having an impact on people around the world, partially because the policy in the United States, a lot of it gets copied and pasted. Not exactly, but sort of more or less copy and pasted. So we want to get things right enough here. We want to protect P2P rights, which is why I also covered the Samurai and Tornado Cash cases. And I don't do that because I just want those rights to exist for me or for Americans. I do that because I think what goes on here is going to have an impact on the rest of the world. The tension that I felt in the Substack piece that I wrote called Why I'm Here is before I got hired at Bitcoin Magazine, I was doing a podcast where I was documenting Bitcoin amongst activists and people in Bitcoin circular economies, places like Bitcoin Akazi or Bitcoin Beach. Those are the two big ones. And I've been to a number of those economies. I think I've been to 5 or 6 of them now in different parts of Africa and Latin America. And I love that stuff. That's the stuff that like fills my soul up. That makes me really, really excited. Dealing with politics does not fill my soul up. It feels like something we have to do right now, but I don't feel like fulfilled after that kind of stuff. I'm happy to be a voice in the room advocating for P2P rights, but it's not always a fun position to take on. So what I felt was this tension of like, and I also write for Forbes. I still do that, documenting Bitcoin adoption around the world. And I enjoy that work, especially doing it for Forbes, because that's like when my high school normie friends see something and they're like, oh, wait, that's a real thing. It's like, yeah, it's been a real thing for like the last 4 years. I've been writing about this in my Substack, but I know that you need to see a Forbes sort of logo above it to make it seem more real to you. So that's fine. I just realized that that's missing in my life deeply. And I missed it so deep. I just missed it I didn't realize how much I missed it until I was in a room with these people and how different it felt to be in that room versus even in the White House. And I'm not going to say it's not exciting to be in the White House. It's quite exciting. Don't get me wrong. It's just a different feeling. And I know deep down that wherever I go from here, I need a certain amount of space in my life, whether it's telling one or two of these stories a month or something like that. I just need to do it on some consistent manner because there are so many people around the world right now, whether they're activists or people doing something in some corner of the world that's maybe not paid attention to enough. Um, they need attention, right? We're human beings. We like to be acknowledged for the work that we do. Trump receives plenty of acknowledgement for the work he does. And I'm not saying this is any slight to him actually, in the middle of my journey of all the jobs I've had, I was actually a driver for The Apprentice. I used to drive the camera crew. So I actually worked with Trump back in the day, which is funny. I would see him, in the dressing room while he was getting his makeup done. He's a character. Um, but the other side to all that stuff is that, as someone who taught immigrants, it's heartbreaking for me to have to see what's going on with ICE and be like, I have to I'm not going to say turn my head. I don't report on ICE. I report on Bitcoin. So it's not like this isn't the thing that I report on. And also, I didn't agree with everything the Biden administration was doing either. So there's just sort of the nature of politics to be trying to find what you have in common with these people. But the harder part with that is most people will stop me, whether it's friends or somebody, if I'm in Latin America or Africa, and they're like, are you like a full-on Trump supporter or whatever? And I don't even answer the question because it's irrelevant. My job with the administration is to essentially, I've said this to people in the administration, it's not just to be a journalist, but I'm an advocate. I'm clear about that. I write for Bitcoin Magazine. It's a thesis-driven publication. We advocate for hyper-Bitcoinization. We don't make that a secret. But it's hard. And the reason I wrote the Substack thing is because, it was weird. I couldn't even like fully cry, sort of discharge the feeling because I felt such conflict all week. But it was just sort of had this knot in my stomach and just sort of on the verge of tears as these people spoke. And I just realized I need more space for it in my life. It's just what makes me happy. It's what connects me to the planet. And I've started, I can't say anything yet, but I've started to make moves to create that space. And ideally, you'll see me documenting more work amongst activists and people doing the real work on the ground all over the world.
Awesome. I want to talk about freedom technology too, just in general, because I feel like that's become a catch-all term that people just kind of throw around. And I'm not sure that I want to, I'm sensitive to the idea that it potentially loses some of its meaning when we kind of just use it as this umbrella term. But for me, when I think of freedom tech, I mean, I of course think of things like Nostr, like censorship resistant communication, bit chats, something like that. What if one of your normie friends asked you like, okay, Frank, this sounds really cool, like freedom tech that that has a nice ring to it. What does that mean? How do you respond to them?
With freedom comes responsibility. So it's technology that you kind of have to take some responsibility for, whether it's Bitcoin or Nostr. You're holding your private keys. It's a little different with something like Signal, which I would also throw in there, maybe BitChat as well. But freedom tech is essentially technology where you cannot be deplatformed because of the corporation that's at the center of it. So BitChat, Signal, Nostr, different Nostr clients. Well, the clients, yeah, that's a little bit different. I'm not really sure exactly how it works. Some of the clients built on top of Nostr, what sort of control they have over you using some of the built-in services. Like, for example, if you're using Primal and the custodial wallet within Primal, you could probably be booted off that. But generally speaking, it wouldn't stop your overall access to Nostr, which is a protocol. Obviously, Bitcoin. Permissionless technology that can be used by people who need privacy, who need to transact permissionlessly. I would imagine that list is growing into the AI space. So I would say open source AI. It would be part of freedom tech at this point. It is a broad term. I would say at the core of that term, if I had to say like three pieces of technology right now that are becoming more popular: Bitcoin, Nostr, Signal, or something along those lines. Things where your messages are private. Not everything you do on Nostr is private, but like you're either private or you're in control of the technology by holding the keys to it. So with Nostr, you could sign into different apps with your NSEC key or private key. And with Bitcoin, obviously, if you're holding your Bitcoin in cold storage or you're running a Lightning node, all that transaction just has to, that's based on your responsibility using the technology, and you're transacting directly with someone else in the digital space. I used to think people were overblowing the need for this technology or like over exaggerating the need for this technology. But after working with a lot of activists in the space, people like Ludmila Kaslavska, Jorge Gerasati, Anna Chekovic, who I mentioned earlier, the HRF team, and a lot of the people in the orbit or who work with HRF, it's life or death technology, whether it's your ability to transact when a government shuts your stuff down, when it shuts your bank account down, your ability to communicate when WhatsApp gets shut off as it did in Venezuela, or when X gets shut off as it did in Venezuela. So I think any of the technology that enables you to communicate despite what a centralized platform, communicate or transact despite what a centralized platform says, or basically there is no centralized platform to have a say in it. That's currently what I would put into sort of the freedom tech basket. That might grow, but I think that's about the extent of my knowledge of what it is right now.
And storytelling, I want to get into storytelling too, because that's obviously important to you. I also think it's important to, to me, I think a lot of our collective cultural wisdom is transmitted, has been transmitted historically through and bequeathed to us through storytelling in a lot of ways. But I think we obviously now live in a bit of a challenging society, I guess, for storytelling. There are a lot of, competing demands on our attention and all the obvious stuff that we talk about. But I also think when you were talking about some of your friends who are a little more left leaning, why they dislike Bitcoin, can you talk about the importance of storytelling in crossing some of these divides and of maybe transcending some of these divides, particularly politically, and maybe some of the challenges of storytelling in our current culture right now?
Yeah, I can only get. I probably wouldn't be so good at describing this. Plus, I'm a New Yorker, and I love to just ramble on about things, as your listeners could probably already tell. So I'll just give you an example, and I mentioned this earlier. So sometimes the message is the medium, and I think that's a way to think. I'm sorry, the medium is the messages. Is the medium is the message. So, for example, the reason I applied to write for Forbes and started writing for Forbes is because I wanted something. I wanted messages to be sent through what's considered what is a mainstream media outlet. Because it's great that we have all this DIY media. It's great that I write for Bitcoin Magazine, and all that stuff is great. But it's a lot. Generally speaking, it's a circle that's expanding more slowly. And for something like Forbes, what it is sort of like there are people going there for non-Bitcoin related things, and then maybe they stumble upon a Bitcoin related thing. And so I write there so that people who are not familiar with Bitcoin and some of the stories that we know, some of the amazing stories of what Bitcoin enables, that they stumble upon this and they're like, wow, this is cool. I never thought about Bitcoin like this. So I'm purposely writing for an outlet that is well known for maybe, I don't know, investment advice or people going there. And I'm writing stories that otherwise maybe you would find on like HRF's website. So I like that juxtaposition of some, like almost a little bit of a tension between this like mainstream media outlet that's, about, I don't know, investing or whatever it is with Forbes money, and then telling these stories about Bitcoin and human rights in the midst of that. So it's sort of injecting a new narrative in a place where it's often not told. And I'll give two examples of why I think that's important. In the Substack letter that you mentioned, I gave an example of a piece I wrote on a community called Afrobit Kibera. So Afrobit is a circular economy in Kibera. Kibera is the largest informal settlement in Africa. Informal settlement is another word for slum. I was actually there last year in Kenya, had a friend of mine get me a car to drive me into the area. And it's quite overwhelming. I'll say that as someone who lived in a barrio, a very poor region of Venezuela, it was more intense than that. It's quite a very intense place in many different ways. But there is a legitimate Bitcoin circular economy that is formed there. There's also investment in education around Bitcoin, broader literacy around coding, trying to hook people up with jobs that exist in the broader Bitcoin space. Even people, these people who are living in Kibera to be able to get decent jobs, not just use Bitcoin as money. So there's this beautiful story that I remember writing the piece for Forbes being like, you would just have to be a bad person to think that this Bitcoin isn't good after reading this story. And it had such an impact that Ronnie Maduida, who runs, one of the people who runs Afrobit Kibera, messaged me and said, like, we're getting a ton of international attention. And that attention, I think, in my opinion, kind of currently has culminated in the BBC doing a 4-minute documentary on it. And the BBC, for those who are not familiar, like hates Bitcoin, like solely negative stuff about Bitcoin. My goal was, again, to inject sort of this narrative into something mainstream, and now a bigger mainstream media outlet took that on, and it succeeded. Another thing that I haven't really written much about, but I did a piece on Simple Proof. So Simple Proof, and this was for Forbes as well. Simple Proof is a company that uses the open timestamps meta protocol on Bitcoin to timestamp election results onto the Bitcoin blockchain so that they become immutable. So for those who don't know, Simple Proof was used to validate or to safeguard the election results in the last presidential election in Guatemala. The party that lost did try to steal ballots, but those ballots had already been counted and put on the blockchain, on the Bitcoin blockchain, not on any blockchain. So they had a dramatic impact in Guatemala, and they also during the presidential election this past year in the United States last November, election results from Screven County, Georgia, a small county of maybe 15 to 20,000 people in Georgia, were also uploaded to the Bitcoin blockchain. I wrote a piece on that, and I found out earlier this year that in a bipartisan bill, two Congress people had stumbled upon the piece I wrote for Forbes and put together a bill based on it, saying this is how we should preserve election results. So I don't think that those two things would have had the impact if it weren't for the medium. I think because they stumbled upon those stories in Forbes. And I told the stories with a little more scaffolding, meaning like I kind of created a little bit more of a framework for the reader who might not be as familiar with what Bitcoin is. And in the case of Simple Proof, the fact that Bitcoin, I know this is a hot debate right now, but that it is also a database and that certain quote unquote arbitrary data can be put into the op return function and stored there or inscribed on it. And I'm not advocating for that. But in the case of preserving, documents that might maintain or that have maintained the integrity of an election, I think that's a really cool use case. Yeah. But I think, the medium as the message would be my biggest takeaway here. It's like, I would say with the Bitcoin space, these conversations, if you're listening to a podcast you normally listen to, I love, as I said earlier, I love the independent spirit of things. I love the DIY spirit of things. But I think there's sort of magic when we go outside of our comfort zone. So for me, that's like extending myself into the mainstream media landscape or going into the White House or something like that. That's where you can start to have a little bit of a different effect. And I think what you also have to do, I guess one more example, earlier this year, I was invited to come ask some questions in the White House press room. I've gone to other press conferences there, but it was Crypto Week, and they were like, "Oh, could you come in, maybe ask some questions around Bitcoin?" And I had to think a lot about what I wanted to ask. I personally want Bitcoin to be money. I'm not a part of this whole Bitcoin is just capital. It's just an investable asset. I don't believe in that. I believe it's money. It's also an investable asset, but when I came in, I was like, okay, well, how can I do this? It can't just be like, this is what I want. This is what Bitcoiners want. And I thought it was a few weeks earlier when Trump was trying to gain support for the One Big Beautiful Bill. And he was saying, we might do a de minimis exemption thing. And so I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, that was just a few weeks ago. It's still top enough of mind for people, for the administration. And I was just like, hey, the president did mention the de minimis tax on Bitcoin. What is that something that's still on his mind? And you do it in a way that's not offensive. And I genuinely wanted to know, is this still a thing he's going to consider for future bills, or is this something that Congress might consider for future bills? And what that resulted in is kind of a meme that went viral of like the White House press secretary saying like, yes, the president is still thinking about Bitcoin as money and this and that. And I'm like, that's the kind of storytelling we want out there. The White House talking about Bitcoin as money. So those would be some places where I think I very much sort of understood the context, what I was dealing with, and did my best to sort of tell the story in a way that fit, given the context, and given that context was maybe outside the mediums that we're more comfortable engaging with.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm thinking a little bit too about, I'm wondering for you, kind of anecdotally with your peers, your friend group, which I'm sure has people of different different parts of the spectrum, if you find it effective to, for me at least, I'm very cognizant of and wary of Bitcoin kind of devolving into a partisan football, which that might be unavoidable. We might already be there. But I think part of like trying to retrieve us from, I guess, maybe the irretrievable slide towards that does kind of involve storytelling. And I'm wondering if you find it effective when you're speaking to folks that might be a more left-leaning audience to tell certain types of stories, or to maybe at least foreground the types of stories that are kind of like human-centric in the way that you've described? I mean, you mentioned that you have some friends who hate Bitcoin. If you tell them, for reasons that, of course, I get it, I understand, I know why. I have the same types of friends who do that as well. Um, do you find it helpful to tell them these stories about these different communities that you visited, different stories that you've written up? How does that resonate? How does that land with them?
It's definitely making a difference. So I'll give you an example. I lived in Namibia for a period of time as well. I did work with, it was a very brief stint, but I was there to do work with with UNICEF and with their Ministry of Education. This was right before I found out what Bitcoin was. And I lived with a woman there who's very, 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 very politically to the left. I didn't live with her like we were together. It was just, she had an extra room, and it was where a friend of mine put me up. And she's been reading my newsletter for 4.5 years, and she's like, like I was a Bernie guy in 2016, and she's like, what happened to the Frank that I knew, blah, blah, blah. And I just had dinner with her, dinner with her the other night. And she runs a program in Namibia that's amazing. It's called Physically Active Youth. It's an after-school program that I think literally the Obamas now help fund. Like she's gotten, if you look her name up, Mary-Jean Ndimbira, it's Ndimbira. She is actually the granddaughter of the first president of Rwanda. So it might come up when you do that as well. So Greg, I can't think of his last name, but Gregory was the first name of the first president of Rwanda. If you look up his granddaughter, you'll see one, a TED talk that she's given, and then two, CNN did a special on what she's doing. And now she can't really touch Bitcoin because she is in that world of like CNN world. She just graduated with her PhD and like, something related to education. And like, obviously you're not going to be talking a lot about Bitcoin in that world. But this week, she was sort of like, she's like, I'm reading everything you're doing. Like, I've been reading it for years now, and I get it. She's like, it's a fairer system. And I'm like, yes. Like, it's hard to see it because we're measuring it through dollars. But even if you just used it as a fundraising mechanism, or used it to maybe just store some of your donations, some of your donations long term, much like the way that, the Bitcoin Akazi project does, which is just next door in South Africa. She's seen me go to these places. She's seen me document it for things like Forbes. And now she's like, okay, I get it. It's a neutral technology. Obviously, the fact that the Trump administration has embraced it is causing a rift. And I think that generally in politics, when one side embraces something, the other side kind of defaults to saying we're on the opposite side of this, because there's no real political power in just agreeing, especially if the party in power, if you're trying to unseat them. I think the Democrats are still going to learn a really rough lesson with being antagonistic towards this technology, though, but that's a conversation for another day. To your point, though, it is changing. For someone like Marie-Jean, who I would say is basically a socialist, like very, very to the left on things, she's, and she's a wonderful human being, and my politics, I wouldn't say they were that far to the left, but they were closer to hers. And I get where she's coming from, in part because I think, and I'm not saying this like, I think it takes time for people to understand what Bitcoin is. And more than that, it takes people to understand what Bitcoin highlights. So it takes time for people to understand what's broken in the system, because oftentimes they think it's the greedy corporations that's causing inflation, or it's this or it's that, when in reality, we know that there's like a foundational issue with the money, and that the way money and the financial system works. So I think it takes time for people to get there. I would say for anyone that's thinking about how to craft their narrative, one thing to do is, however well you craft it, understand that it is not going to land with everyone. I thought I was like the most brilliant person in all of my circles when I started writing a Substack, and I was like, I'm going to teach everybody about Bitcoin. And I would say at first it probably made a lot of people question my sanity, and, caused issues between me and family members. So I would just say it's a long game. The storytelling arc is a long game. I think it does make a difference to tell these human rights stories, but you have to mean it. You have to live it. It can't just be like, oh, I really like Bitcoin, the price is going up. And also some people in Africa use it. It can't be an afterthought. It has to be something that you can properly articulate, that resonates with people. When you talk about this thing, it has to actually have that impact. It can't just be like, Alex Gladstein and HRF are really cool, and also Michael Saylor is the best. Like it's just like it's a it has to be told with some level of authenticity, especially amongst people who are not going to be easily persuaded about this.
Yeah. I had a similar, yeah, I mean, my kind of first foray into publishing stuff in Bitcoin, I wrote some pieces for Bitcoin Mag, probably like, I don't know, 2021-ish. I was also a Bernie person. And the pieces, it was like a series called From Bernie to Bitcoin,
Mm.
and which you can imagine how that landed with some Bitcoiners at the time. So I got a lot of colorful responses. They're basically like, "Oh, you lost me at the word Bernie, and this person is, definitionally an idiot." And which I get it, but it's interesting the political evolution. So many of my friends who are in Bitcoin have had, myself included, have had personal evolutions in their own politics that it's not like a dial that gets turned from left to right or from right to left. It's almost like you sort of like step away from the dial entirely, I guess. And
Yes.
you kind of,
Yes.
you realize that, yeah. So for me, I mean, I almost feel, sort of politically homeless now. And I kind of understand where both sides are coming from. But to me, both sides are still kind of missing maybe the most important thing. But I don't know if you struggle with that personally, navigating your own environment, just being political. Or I mean, I don't even want to assume what your politics are personally. I apologize if that was me assuming
It's
that.
all good.
Um, but how do you think about what Bitcoin does to folks politically, that you've observed?
Yeah, I noticed it's a similar effect. There's a meme, I think it's like the Joker sitting on the subway. It's like a scene from the movie Joker where it's two people arguing about politics and then like the Bitcoin logo next to Joker and he doesn't care. Now like I don't like necessarily like trying to conceptualize us as all the anti-hero, but there's a certain level of like what we've realized is that the issue isn't necessarily left or right, though the right and the left have some impact on. I'll put it this way. Um, I will no longer. So my only rule with voting is I won't vote for someone who won't allow the escape hatch to exist. So if you're going to be antagonistic to Bitcoin, like if that's really it, left or right doesn't really matter. If you're going to be antagonistic and say this thing shouldn't be whatever, or even say like every wallet needs KYC or anything, that's like okay, that's my only rule. I don't really have a rule for who I vote for. It's just who I don't vote for. That's really it at this point, and which is it sounds nihilistic, but it I can't see it any other way right now. That might change, but when people ask me, even like, and I don't give an answer on it, like, who'd you vote for in this last election? It just, I didn't vote for anyone that was antagonistic towards this technology, and I leave
Yeah.
it at that. It doesn't necessarily mean I voted for one or the other, who I did vote for, whether I voted or not, all that kind of stuff. And so that's the way I look at it. But I think the other side of it is that when you find out what Bitcoin is and when you fully sort of have that experience with it after years of really kind of internalizing it and understanding it, you understand that so many of the arguments going on in politics, one, the resolution with most of it is going to be more money printing. So like whether it's like on the left, we're printing more money for social services, or on the right, or on both sides, we're printing more money to finance debt, whatever it is, it's just like, it's like, okay, well, sort of one of the fundamental issues isn't getting resolved from either side here. So it provides you with this sort of like, unless someone is speaking to like the heart of the issue, which right now I would argue is currency debasement, and that really can't change because that otherwise looks like the U.S. defaulting on its debt. It's like there's not much I can really do now. Like, granted, it's not that people. So, for example, like I don't really care that Mamdani might win because there's a lot of people hurting in New York City right now. So for those who don't know, Mamdani is like the avowed socialist who is running for mayor of New York City, and it doesn't really bother me that much. I don't like it. Like I'm not going to vote for him, mostly, but not because he's a socialist, more because he doesn't have a Bitcoin policy. So he doesn't have a stance on Bitcoin. So it's this thing where I'm like, one, even if you start to understand Bitcoin, you might not have enough money to put into it where it would start to make like a real difference in your life. So for right now, if you're just in a lot of pain and you're looking to vote for someone who's promising they're going to take you out of that pain, and Mamdani feels like that for you, or maybe he will be that for you in the short term. I think in the long term he'll make things worse, but it is what it is. I don't wrong people for that, because when you're in that sort of pain, I've been there, living paycheck to paycheck and all that kind of stuff. You just want the pain to stop. And if somebody's coming around saying it's going to stop, um, I get why people would vote for that. Again, I don't really think he's going to deliver on what he's saying he's going to deliver on. But what does bother me is seeing like the Bill Ackmans of the world say like, I can't believe we're going to have like a socialist in New York. I'm like, I can believe it. It was like Wall Street is the biggest benefactor of socialism. We bail out Wall Street all the time. Like the thing that you're such a proponent of gets it's the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, like, we have socialism for the rich and rugged free market capitalism for the poor. And I still believe that. So it's like there's a part of me even, I will say this, I covered the DNC and I watched Bernie speak thinking to myself, like, wow, 2016, this would have been kind of surreal. I'm standing up front here as Bernie speaking. And I was just sort of like, this does nothing for me. Like, this dude is totally missing it. Kind of economically illiterate in some ways, but at the same time, I'm like, I think he means it. I think he wants things to be better for people. So I don't wrong people who don't understand what Bitcoin is. I just think the thing that people don't realize is, like, I lived in Venezuela under the Chavez regime. I understand why people wanted Chavez to become president. There were plenty of poor people. It was dignifying for people to see like a non-gringo looking person to become president of the country. It was dignifying for some of the early work he did was actually amazing. So they had things called the Misiones, which brought in doctors from Cuba and Nicaragua to help to help people be able to see doctors who otherwise couldn't afford it. It made college more affordable. It did a lot of good at the beginning, but there were also things like state-run grocery stores. And most people don't understand this, but when you mess with prices like that, it ends up creating shortages. And that's what leads to like Soviet Union style collapses. So when Mamdani, I'm going to say something, I haven't shared this yet. His office so I live in Queens. It's about 2 blocks from my front door. I walk by his office almost every day. It's above my favorite grocery store in the neighborhood, like the most well-run private. Like that's how I think I really believe we live in a simulation. But it's this thing where I'm like, he probably goes there for like lunch or to pick up food or something like that. But it's this thing where he might not even have an understanding of economics enough to know that like when you start doing that, you're going to put people running businesses that already have very small margins out of profit, and on the back end you're going to create shortages because people who are along the supply chain of getting that food to the shopping market are not going to get paid properly, and that's going to create a number of issues. Do I think he gets to a point where he actually creates state-run grocery stores? I don't know. Do I think that if that happens, it will result in things getting much worse in New York? For sure. And at the same time, I empathize with the people who are hurting. So it's a very complicated thing where at the end of the day, like my politics can only be, I believe in the escape hatch. And for people who say like, well, what about, poorer people or people don't have the money to invest? It's not like I've been to Bitcoin Akazi. I've been to a bunch of the circular economies. These are some of these were or are some of the poorest people on the planet living in like very, very poor neighborhoods. They've figured out a way to do it. They've figured out a way to benefit from this. So I would say one thing that people don't realize with the poor, I was a social worker. I worked in Brownsville, New York, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. The poor know how to economize because they have to. If you actually gave the poor decent money to work with, I think you'd be amazed at what they end up coming up with. Poor are also quite entrepreneurial and quite thrifty. They think about this stuff again because they have to. The bigger problem with it is that the harder part to sort of get past is they're not in a savings mentality because social systems usually only give them enough to keep them on the hamster wheel. But if they actually had something where they felt that they had stake in something, they felt that they owned something, it would change the dynamic and it would ultimately, over the long term, change their psychology. So any politician who's talking about this stuff, they have to have some sort of strategy. And there's great examples of that on the Democratic side. We have Richie Torres in the Bronx. This is the congressman for one of the poorest districts in America that's pro-Bitcoin. It's not mutually exclusive to say I live in a place where people need social services and I'm pro this technology. These two things do not have to be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I really I struggle with the I get it in the beginning of everybody's Bitcoin journey. They're kind of like rah, like have fun staying poor and all that type of stuff. But I find it really I think what you said is just important to understand why people feel the way that they do, if you're going to communicate with them, and if you're going to be able to sort of like sort of reach them and the storytelling and stuff like that, you have to have the negative capability, and to be able to understand why they feel the way that they do. My wife and I talk about this all the time with Bernie, with respect to Bernie. That the one thing you could say for Bernie is like, whether you agree or disagree with him, is that he sounds sincere. I mean, I think that he believes what he's saying, and I think he's trying his best to identify what the problem is. Do we think that he's misidentifying it? Yeah, probably. But is he earnestly, trying to address that issue? Yeah, I think so. And it's hard to be, as angry at somebody who's not really acting nefariously. They're just kind of like earnestly maybe misdiagnosing what the actual upstream issue is.
That's
Um,
it.
but I want to talk a little bit, Frank, about, on the show. I like to explore the nexus between Bitcoin, the humanities, art, culture, that type of thing, aspects of society that I don't think get as much attention in the Bitcoin space, but that I think are uh, are important in a variety of different ways, across the economic spectrum for folks. But I'm wondering, from your perspective as somebody who is involved with freedom technology, um, do you think that there is any relationship between what I'll call, I guess, the precarious state of freedom in the world? And I mean, things like digital IDs, increased surveillance, capital control countries, stuff like that. This sort of, slouching in that direction that we're seeing with respect to freedom, and the maybe, I don't know if I'll say equally precarious, but we'll say like diluted, I guess, state of the arts in the world right now. They're very short form, very corporate captured, very hyper nakedly commercial, low time or high time preference. Do you see any relationship between those two things? And do you think that freedom technology has a role to play in maybe restoring or flipping that script a little bit?
I think totally. And I'll speak more. I think for sure it does. You know, right now, I would say the biggest piece of that freedom tech stack that does is Bitcoin, and the fact that it accrues, you gain purchasing power over time, because what you're talking about is essentially getting your life force back. And if you're constantly on a hamster wheel and you're constantly tired, you're not going to create good art. Well, some people might. Some people kind of create good art out of a state of desperation, but even that art, um, it's kind of difficult to write your magnum opus when you don't have the time. So you might do something kind of more shorter, bite-sized, less thought out, less refined, because you just don't have the effort, the space to do that. When you actually have some savings and you're not so worried about, every last penny you spend or every last sat you spend or whatever, it's a little bit of your mind goes to a different place. So like I didn't start actually having any sort of legitimate savings until like my mid to late 30s. I'm ashamed to say that, or I was ashamed to say that for a while. I just didn't really understand money well enough. I was saving in dollars through most of my 20s and stuff. When I was even saving money, I traveled a lot. So it's it's this thing where when something doesn't feel right, having the ability to walk away from it or distance yourself, like saying like, I don't need to do this to pay my bills and to keep the lights on. That freedom starts once you're in that headspace. You start looking at the world differently, and you start thinking like, okay, I want to dedicate some time to just creating stuff. And I think that creative process, if it's not at the front of your mind to commercialize it, what you're going to create is going to feel better to people. So like, I don't commercialize my Substack. People have asked me to, they've been willing to pay for it. I try to write from my heart as much as possible when I write my Substack. I just want that to be one thing where people feel like they're actually getting like Frank, not Frank through Bitcoin Magazine or not Frank through Forbes. And I put all links to that stuff in there, but you get a different version of me there. And I don't want that to have to be about money. That's just a place where people can go if they want to experience, one or two big thoughts that have gone through my head that week or whatever. So I think we do move into that, but right now I would say that has something to do with censorship resistance and that kind of stuff that Freedom Tech offers, but it has more to do with preserving your purchasing power and value over the long haul. I think that's what Bitcoin does. At least that's the Freedom Tech that has mostly changed my life. I will say too, as a creator, I think putting your work on X versus putting it on Nostr, and a platform like Primal or Damus, I think you have to come a little bit more correct on Nostr. On X, you can do some bullshit, copy and paste what someone else has done, get your retweets, get the bots and pumped up, blah blah blah. Whereas on Nostr, you kind of have to like bring some real, just like it needs to be a little bit more thought out, a little bit more genuine, I think. So I would say that that's the next thing I'm seeing. It's sort of like, okay, some real good quality original content, you'll get your value for that. People will zap you. They will send you some Bitcoin over Lightning when you do bring quality there. But I wouldn't say that. I mean, you could argue that that alone in itself becomes a catalyst for creating more quality content. So I would say primarily Bitcoin, but I think Nostr is starting to have a little bit of that effect as well.
Yeah. And I think with Nostr, I mean, what I find refreshing is, I'm a big, I think I think we will look back, 10, 20, 30 years from now at the algorithms that have governed our lives, particularly on Twitter, as being one of the most, basically being like heroin. I mean, I think we'll look at it with the same level of kind of revulsion that this is, in the sense that this is just so obviously bad,
Yep.
psychologically, for people. I think for creators, it's bad. The incentives are terrible. And Bitcoin is obviously about restoring incentives in a lot of ways. But I want to ask you a question, Frank, about your music, your experience in the music business, and how it might relate to this. You talked about, when I think about like the sort of initial kind of punk rock move, I guess maybe like the 80s punk rock move, where you have like Black Flag, Minor Threat, Bad Brains, that stuff. And hopefully listeners aren't like too, zoning out as we talk about this, but you could have kind of that DIY mentality, the sort of get in the van mentality, the Minutemen, that type of stuff. And you could sort of make a living, kind of. You could kind of squeeze one by. Do you think that the state of the hamster wheel kind of society that we live in now is so acute and insurmountably intense and pressurized that it's all, and also just because you have the algorithms that are determining the way that people are discovering the creative things that they're into, do you think it makes something like a Minor Threat almost impossible in terms of just being able to achieve the cultural salience that Minor Threat ultimately did, in terms of finding an audience to discover them, and pay money to buy things from them?
Yeah, I love that. I love this question. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually. I think there's a factor that you have to consider when it comes to something like Minor Threat, and that's like closer to them being the first when it came
Mm,
to like from a genre perspective. I don't think it has so much to do with like th- making a living out of the DIY culture as much as like I think as the longer a genre exists, the harder it is to be popular in that genre. So like I'm not taking
yeah,
anything away from like Bob Dylan as a singer-songwriter, but it was like easier to be a folk singer in like the early 1960s if you were good at it than it is to try to be a folk singer today in,
sure.
20. So I think that there's a little bit of that dynamic there. But the reason I would say no, I think like so I was thinking about this in terms of music. I've been listening to this band. I just found them, and they kind of bring me back to a little bit of like it's a vibe. I don't love everything, but Spanish love songs. Really, really interesting band. Good lyrics, and I'm sort of like, oh, I'm like it came up on my Spotify thing, and I'm like, I remember when bands wrote stuff like this, and like not trying to sound like an old man. And honestly, I'll do like a full stop there. I found stuff in my adult life. I don't know. Maybe people know these like the Mensingers, Julian Baker, Boy Genius. Like I found stuff that I'm like, oh, this makes me feel the way I felt when I was in high school. Like this is real good craftsmanship here. Um, but I would say that what we've seen we're doing a Bitcoin podcast right now with people making a living out of that. I think even like, I've gotten to know Danny Knowles pretty well from what Bitcoin did. And like, they were earlier. So this is like before Bitcoin podcasts were super popular, but I mean, that's a living for him. He
Yeah,
obviously Peter McCormack popularized it. And for those who don't know, Peter McCormack also had a background in marketing. And I think he was really good at marketing his podcast, but he did it DIY. There was no huge, I mean, you could argue that the corporate sponsorship was Gemini or Ledger or whatever people he partnered with. And that's fine. Those weren't necessarily the people that I would have be the advertisers for my show, but they're not the worst people to advertise either. So it's like, we're seeing people do that. We're seeing people spin up smaller businesses. We're seeing people make stuff work. Maybe it's not 100% a career, but even with a lot of those bands back in the day in the 80s, those bands didn't come home from tour and like put their legs up and sip martinis. They went back to go work their shitty job on like a construction, site or at a supermarket or something. So
Yeah.
if you want to make something that's groundbreaking, revolutionary, interesting, and you're not just trying to capitalize on, an algorithm or a popular trend, it's hard. Art is hard. I do it as a hobby. I learned how hard it is, and I learned how sad and poor, you could be when you try to pursue it full time if you really believe in the art and don't want to compromise on that. I'm not saying people shouldn't, but it's just there's trade-offs with that kind of stuff. And I think the magic, for most people is going to be in finding, I don't think there's any completely pure, everything this artist does is completely pure. There's no commercial thought whatsoever in it. And then, the extreme of that would just be like the derivative of like the Backstreet Boys or something like, like some popular version of music that then gets, a billion derivatives of it. I would say, I'll thank you for having me on. I would say with like the Bitcoin podcast at this point, I really like seeing people have different people on, even knowing that maybe they're not going to get as many views. Going after like Michael Saylor or Luke Gromen or Lynn Alden, like, love Luke Gromen, love Lynn Alden, love hearing their macro thoughts, but like, do we need them to be on every podcast? Like, I don't think so. Ideally, we start highlighting other voices that have different perspectives to bring to the table, even if those things don't get a billion clicks. Because I think also with the bigger stuff, with the macro stuff, I think people, one, they like to learn, and some of these people have like tons of experience on Wall Street or as an investor or whatever, so they're sharing information, and that's cool. But the other side to that is a lot of it is sort of like confirmation bias. Like, you're right with Bitcoin, we're going to get rich, and I think some of that makes people stop doing some of the work that's necessary to support it. So like, whether that's, I don't know, calling a congressman and trying to get them to pass a bill that's going to protect developers, like the current iteration of Market Structure Clarity Act. It's sometimes I think listening to like the bigger names talk about this is what Bitcoin is and theoretically, and you're going to be rich, and we're so early, it sort of takes you out of the equation. You just sort of think you're along for this ride and it's all going to be fine, that you don't have a role to play. And I'll be honest, as someone who has taken on a certain role in the community, it's not always fun playing this role. There's days I say this all the time to friends. I'm like, man, I want to go back to the days of listening to like Jeff Booth on what Bitcoin did in like 2021 and just being like, it's all going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. Yeah. It's going to magically, and I've become friends with Jeff. I'm not saying he's saying it's going to magically happen. I think he even admits that there's going to be a lot of hurdles we need to surmount. But I think the big thing with Bitcoin is like, you want to be the hero in your own story. I think that's the real thing here. I think that's sort of the magic to Bitcoin, that we all sort of all of our lives get better as a result, but we have to take responsibility in that story, and we have to advocate for the things about Bitcoin that we really care about and want to see.
Yeah, I love all that. I think that's really well articulated. And I think, the reason that I started this show is because I just thought that, my background, I'm an attorney by day. But my background, like I told, I wanted to be an English professor. To me, you can see all the books, all the stuff behind me. This is all
Good
really
stuff.
important to me. I really wanted to be an English professor for a long time, and it was really kind of a lot of more like the financial outlook of that was what kind of made that really hard to envision. But the reason I started the show is because I just don't think that these ideas about art and culture, that they get discussed enough in the Bitcoin podcast world. And not to criticize any other show, but I just think, for me, my thesis is, look, we're going to fix the money, sure, and I want to do that. That's great, we're doing that. But downstream of that, there's a lot of other stuff that we're going to have the opportunity to reconstruct, that we're going to have the opportunity to build, and it's going to actually require a lot of dialogue between people who care about things other than just money. That the money is a tool, and I view some of the other, kind of like Lynn and Luke, who again, we are not by any stretch of the imagination besmirching.
Love them both.
Yeah, I love them both as well.
Yeah.
To me, some of the I imagine some listeners are going to that almost. It's like church versus the kind of like this. I was just describing Bitcoin. Some Bitcoin podcasts as like the salons in France, where we're exchanging ideas. That's kind of the environment that I want to inspire here. Is like, look, let's kind of hash out some ideas here. It's not going to be a prescription. It's not going to be, here's kind of your liturgical say amen when I say this type of thing.
Totally.
It's going to be, let's like, you have thoughts that are interesting. Let's put them out there. Let's discuss them, and go from there. And I'm hoping we get more of that. But I agree, because I think it actually brings in more people too. I think if you
Totally.
give other people content that they might not gravitate towards the more macroeconomic stuff. So I mean, I think it's important for adoption too.
100%. I mean, I one of the things I will be doing more, as I said, writing more stories about adoptions, particularly in Latin America and Africa, for Forbes. And I may bring back what I was doing with my podcast, where I was predominantly speaking with like the people on the ground, interfacing with their communities, having conversations with them, where I would very specifically ask them, like, I'm not here to cheerlead Bitcoin. I'm here to, there's a lot of this narrative, Bitcoin will save Africa or this or that. I don't really believe in that. I just think well, not that I don't think it's going to help. I just don't think that it's just this magical solution that we wave over something. There's real stuff that has to be done on the ground for this to be facilitated and to be done in a way where people understand self-custody and where they really get the benefits of what Bitcoin is. So I like having conversations about what's working, but also just as much what's not working. Like what is sort of what's in the narrative that's not true. For example, I interviewed somebody who's from a part of India that's on the border of Nepal. You may have noticed that during the revolution in Nepal, everyone's like, everyone downloaded BitChat, and everybody was using BitChat, this new app that
Yeah.
jackdoors. 50,000 people downloaded BitChat. There were about 12 million people that were involved in the protest. That's like half of 1%. Am I happy that 50,000 people downloaded it? For sure. What was missing from that conversation was the context. And the other
Yeah.
part that was missing was when I asked that person why weren't more activists and people using Bitcoin for remittances at the time, especially when they were blocking, when they were shutting down parts of the internet or whatever, they were like, because a lot of the people that are the activists are more politically to the left and they look at Bitcoin as an extension of capitalism, so they don't want to use it. That narrative wasn't on Twitter. The narrative on Twitter was like, Freedom Tech is saving Nepal. So it's like, let's at least diagnose the problem properly. Let's at least sort of talk about what the impediments are to broader adoption, whether that's people's psychology or something technical, whatever it is. And to me, that's more interesting. The thing about it, though, is like it doesn't produce the dopamine, the serotonin, all that kind of stuff. And it also sort of like, it's kind of unsexy. It's like, wait, this isn't just going to magically happen. It's like, well, there's going to be some element of magic involved. I think Bitcoin is totally magic. It blows my mind that somebody figured out how to make a Bitcoin, like how to make this network. I think that's absolutely magic. It's just that we're psychological, we're social creatures. We're psychological creatures where it's like it needs to be explained to us in certain ways. We need to be taught how to do this stuff. We need to learn how to take responsibility, ownership. I teach once in a while. I do a guest lecture in a program called Bitcoin Dada, which teaches African women how to use Bitcoin. In one of my first slides, I say something along the lines of like, yeah, Bitcoin is a tool for freedom, but it's it's a commitment to taking responsibility for yourself, your seed phrase, all that stuff. And it's going to physiologically change you. You're going to have to understand what that level of responsibility feels like. None of the women sign off. They're like, okay, but like, it's a thing. Like I think about this a lot, especially being a more public figure in the space. Like Bitcoin is a bearer asset. Someone could put a knife to my throat anytime and ask me. I think about this kind of stuff a lot. There's a certain, by putting yourself out there and getting into the mix, there's a real responsibility that comes with that, and just generally speaking, even if you don't want to become a public figure in this space, just taking responsibility for that seed phrase and what that feels like, it's a real thing. It's a real thing. It's why so many people don't do it. They leave it on Coinbase or they leave it wherever they bought it, or they buy an ETF just because they say, I don't trust myself. That process of trusting yourself is learning how to do it. If you don't, or just taking that responsibility on, is going to change you emotionally, and I would even say physiologically in the long term.
Yeah, totally. I think, unlearning some of the habits and maybe sort of types of behavior, the things that we value that have just sort of been inculcated, by our existence in the society we exist in, I think is a challenging process, but is necessary. That's kind of a part of Bitcoin adoption. Just doesn't get talked about. Is there's a lot of psychological unlearning of things and or sort of rewiring of values. And it's not that you didn't have these values before. It's just maybe they weren't foregrounded as much. They weren't. It's the triaging of the values, the ordering and sequencing of them, and the sort of the levels of emphasis. And I think this is why when people kind of sleep on the humanities being a part of this story, part of my pushback is, a helpful way to try to ease that process is to use things like storytelling, is to use some of these lessons we've learned through the humanities that deal with these kind of psychological transitions. And I think that's helpful. It's very non-intuitive in the sense that or I guess it's non-obvious to a lot of people who come to this from a more macroeconomic perspective, where they're like, why do I give a shit? Logan, you're on Nostr or Twitter, like with your bidax and your copy of Hamlet, and you're like making jokes about decentralizing hash rate and reading Shakespeare. That's
Yeah.
cute and cool, but like, why would I actually do that? And
Right.
first of all, you guys should all decentralize hash rate,
Yeah.
get a bidax.
Yeah.
Second of all, the reason why you read books like that and you sort of engage with art and the humanities is I do think that's a lot of like these sort of like soft connectors and that just help help people with some of that tough human stuff, which is why I love what you do, Frank. I mean, you're so human centered that it's that stuff is really helpful. That's meaningful.
That means a lot to me. I don't always know how it's landing with people, so it's helpful to know that somebody out there feels that way. I think for me, and maybe it's a lesson to people in this space. If you're going to stick around in this space, if you do want to sort of make a name for yourself, don't do it by being like a troll on Twitter or something like that. Find something about this space that really resonates with you. For me, that's people. For me, it's people being included in a fairer financial system rather than being excluded by the unfair old financial system or being abused by the old financial system. It's people. So I used to call my podcast New Renaissance Capital, and that was, again, it had a similar effect of like, the first thing you would think about there is maybe like a hedge fund. You wouldn't think of like, oh, this is interviewing people on the ground in like villages in Africa or
Hmm.
something. But people like to think of themselves as investors, as having stake in something, right? Like having this thing that's going to make their lives better, that's going to give them more purchasing power, more freedom, more of their time back in the long haul. And I think everybody deserves that. And I think putting a positive spin on this stuff. I was with Jeff Booth last week, and I was saying, one of the things about Bitcoin media that I struggle with is like there's a lot of outrage. There's a lot of like burn down the Fed and do this, and like a lot of focusing on the old system. And there's not enough highlighting the importance of what this is doing for people, but really, and giving those people, not giving like, and I love Alex Gladstein, don't get me wrong, but not hearing about what HRF is doing through his lens, but through the people it impacts, having the conversation with the people on the ground in these places. And also with him. I mean, Alex is an amazing character and has done tremendous things for the Bitcoin space and for human beings in general. But what's often overlooked is like, what does this actually mean? So the most downloaded podcast I did when I was doing this, I had a few bigger names on it. When I was doing this like 2 years ago, was I had two women from the Bitcoin Data program talked about what it was like to learn about Bitcoin as an African woman and what difference that made in their life. That was the most downloads that I had. So it's like, it's a weird thing where there's a lot, we all want to be heard. All human beings want to be recognized and heard. And I think that there's more value than people realize in thinking to yourself like, okay, this is what really interests me about the space. Like you want to approach it through this humanities lens and have these conversations. There's two things about that. One, it may get bigger than you expected, or it may grow into something you didn't expect, and that's great. But two, you'll feel better about yourself if you only reach, let's say you reach 100 people with this. You'll feel better having reached those 100 people, actually expressing something, or having a guest on that's, having a conversation that feels expressive to you, like you're relaying a message you actually wanted to relay, than reaching 100,000 people doing a song and dance that doesn't feel good, natural, or like it's actually pushing the conversation forward. So I would say to people, like, don't worry too much about how big or small or whatever you're doing is. Focus more on, what it's kind of like your first investment in Bitcoin. You're not going to get rich overnight. Your podcast isn't going to be huge overnight. Your company is not going to be a smashing success overnight. But when you do it, when it feels like an extension of you and something that you're trying to put out into the world, that will become a fuel that you don't fully understand at first. That will be the fuel that keeps you doing it in basically an irrational manner, I think, through most of it. And then maybe it does become something bigger, and maybe you can quit your job and do whatever you're doing, do whatever. But I would say just don't aim for that. Aim to make a really good piece of art, a good piece of content, a good company, or whatever, however you choose to engage, and allow that to to grow, because you'll be super proud of it if it's, if it grows into something and you did it your own way. You'll be much more proud of that than sort of doing it in a way that didn't feel natural or like the right way you wanted to do it.
Yeah, I love that. That's also the Ian Mackay. That's the Fugazi way to do it. And you'll get those true. The people who want and need to find it will find it and respond to it. I think much more profoundly. So Frank, I want to angle this to a close a little bit. Just we're kind of I want to be respectful of your time and listeners. You know, um, you know, keeping us in the sweet spot in the pocket here, time wise. But I want to give listeners a little bit of glimpse into probably a side of you maybe they don't know as well, which is my understanding, Frank, is that you are a triathlete. Is that correct?
I am a triathlete.
You're a
Yeah,
triathlete.
yeah.
What is wrong with you, Frank? And how are you? Why are you doing this? But let me ask you this: have you always been like into that, or is this been a
Question.
relative?
Yeah, so I found it. I was a very, very, very competitive high school runner. I ran on an insane team. So I'll put it in context. I ran like my mile was like 440 or something in high school, and I was 12th on my team. So our best miler was running, I think, 412 or something like that, and then we had a bunch that were under 416. So I ran really competitively and burnt out. I don't think it was like I think I couldn't even do the last season of spring track. I was just so tired. And it left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. But I was also a lifeguard, so during the summers I would do these like just short triathlons. And then honestly, I spent years drinking, not like alcoholic drinking, but like partying, college, post college, not taking care of myself, not exercising. And in my mid 30s, I found Rich Roll. So if you don't know Rich Roll, he has a podcast called the Rich Roll
Yeah.
Podcast, but he wrote a book called Finding Ultra. And it's the subtitle of that book that caught my attention. It was on an Instagram post. Oddly enough, the person who posted it was John Joseph, the singer of a band called the Cro-Mags, another punk hardcore band from the 80s who does triathlons, Ironmans. And one of those parts of the subheading was blah, 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 finding myself, like whatever, self-help sort of vibe, but rejecting middle age. I read Rejecting Middle Age and I was like, I'm gonna start rejecting middle age. That sounds great. Like I want to reject some middle age. So I'm in my mid to late 30s at the time, read that book. And so Rich Roll's story is sort of, he was an alcoholic. He was way out of shape. He was, earlier in his life, a swimmer at Stanford. But he got back into doing Ironman and even further distance triathlon at like 42 years old. I'm 43 right now. So I got back into it a few years younger than him. So I took between the time that I ran in high school and did some shorter triathlons in my early 20s to getting back into it at maybe 36, 37, 38 years old. There was a huge gap where I stopped, and now I train 6 days a week religiously unless I'm sick. But as sort of like a moving meditation. I'm not trying to win,
Yeah.
Ironman world championships, but I do it. You said, what's wrong with you? There's plenty of things that are wrong with me. I do the triathlon training to try to cure the things that are wrong with me and find some peace in the world. So for me, some people can sit still, meditate, maybe go to church, whatever. I need to move. I have a lot of energy. So I need to actually discharge that energy, and swimming, biking, and running are the ways that I find peace. And I really like, waking up early and doing races and I do them with my sister. I have 3 younger sisters. I do them with some of my sisters, and it's sort of like a family thing where all my extended family comes out and they cheer us on. So it's a really beautiful thing. And it's made me, I'm not married. I still have to look like okay. Still have to kind of like, gives me a good reason to sort of stay in shape and be presentable enough when I go on dates. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to be fair, yeah, you're me telling you what's wrong with you is just my expression of admiration. I'm trying to. I think I find a lot of Bitcoiners who are kind of more into health stuff now, health and wellness and longevity stuff. I'm 30, about to be 37 in a couple of weeks, so I'm also very much trying to reject middle age as vehemently and aggressively as possible. But I think like Bitcoin in my life makes me feel a little bit like, well, like if this goes the way that I think it's going to go, then yeah, I want to have as much time on this earth with my children and my wife as
Totally.
possible. So it's
Yep.
you don't feel like you need to necessarily sacrifice all of that health stuff to make fiat wages that are going to lose their purchasing power anyway, which
Yep.
creates a little doom loop. But anyways, well, that's all very cool, Frank. I think that's a good place to wrap up, just because I want to leave listeners with, things that you should remember from the show are you should, tell human stories, focus on human-centric things. You should reject middle age. You should decentralize the hash rate, and you should
Yep.
read Shakespeare. So
Can I do
all,
a, can I do
yeah,
a quick shill if you don't mind regarding the
please.
hash rate? So I'm also an advisor to HeatBit. They make home heating devices. I'm not saying go out and buy one. I would just say check them out though. They are very cool.
Absolutely.
They're a little bit pricier than BitAxe is, but what's funny about them? I was just with Siri, who does the head of growth for HeatBit. They're really nice looking, and they're not just sort of marketing to Bitcoiners. But I just wanted to assure people, the two people who are behind this device, especially the guy who created it, are very much hardcore Bitcoiners who are not just looking to sell heating devices that also mine Bitcoin. They are very much looking to decentralize the hash rate as far as physical hardware is concerned. So just something to put out there.
Yeah, winter is coming, guys. If you
That's
have a
right.
garage gym that you're trying to reject middle age inside of in the middle of winter, get yourself a heat bit.
That's
There's
it.
the sales pitch right there. We'll tie it
I
all
love it.
together.
Yeah.
Frank, this was great. Can you just tell people where they can find you? You're writing in multiple places now. Tell listeners where they can find your work, support your work, where they can find you on socials, Noster, X, etc.
Totally, yeah. And thank you for this opportunity. Really, really appreciate it and really enjoyed this conversation. You can find me on Twitter, my name, just at Frank Corva. On Noster, there's an NPub. I don't know what it is, but I think if you just put my name into, I don't know, Primal or Damus, it'll come up, Frank Corva. It's frankcorva.substack.com, Bitcoin Magazine, Forbes. The Substack is probably the most all-encompassing. It's where I share whatever I worked on that week and also just include some of my own thoughts. That's about it. Everything else, yeah, via those things, whatever I might be missing. But I would say definitely, if you're not signed up for Noster, maybe have this be your call to action. Noster is awesome. Even if you're just sort of like you want some Bitcoin and you don't want to spend your dollars on it, I've made a few $100s, I would say, worth of sats this year, just posting some content. Some of it my reporting, some of it just telling stories about my life that resonated with people, and they
Yeah.
zapped me some sats. So I would just say, there's no harm in it. If you don't love it because the interface kind of sucks, I get it, fine. But to post whatever you're posting on Instagram or Twitter and then also post it on Noster is not really a heavy lift, and I think you'll sort of you'll enjoy the benefits in the long term.
Yeah, 100% agree, co-sign that for sure. Well, Frank, thank you so much again for being on Think Bitcoin podcast. We appreciate it. We'll definitely have to do a part 2 at some time. But thank you. And for everybody else, we will see you next time. Bye-bye.